Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Comic Source. I'm your host, Jace. Welcoming my buddy, Chris Ryall, back to the show to talk about a really special project that comes out this week. If you're listening to this on the day that it releases, November 12th, that's when this is in stores. So, Chris, welcome back to the show. Thanks for taking the time. And why don't you let everybody know what we're here to talk about today?
Yeah, well, first, man, thank you for having me back. Always good to talk to you. This week, one of my two big Marvel books these two archival Marvel books that I worked on that just happened to come out just a couple weeks apart. The second of which, the Mighty Marvel Calendar book, A Visual History, comes out, like you say, on November 12th. And what that is it's a 13 by 13 hardcover collection of these 7 very unique calendars that Marvel released in the mid-'70s to the early '80s that treated sort of every bit of a calendar, a wall-hanging calendar in a much more artistic sort of way. They treated every page like an artifact and not just like you would often get in calendars, where it was like a piece of stock photography atop, and then underneath was a grid full of empty boxes with the dates of each month on them. What Marvel did was, for these 7 years, pretty much every square on every month's grid had something cool and interesting in there, whether it was a quote from an old comic book, a bit of trivia about a comic, a release date, creator birthdays, all kinds of things along those lines, bunches of cool little bits of clip art. And another thing that it had that was really cool at the time was it had photos of a lot of the different Marvel bullpen creators, writers, artists, and some of the staff that worked there too. And at that point, like, none of us knew what Marvel employees looked like. We probably saw Stan Lee. I mean, there was probably at least caricatures, or self-drawn portraits of Jack Kirby, that he drew. But for the most part, you didn't see the creators behind the scenes making these books. And so even though they were just sort of black and white photos, it was really cool that it just kind of like a lot of Marvel's efforts back in that day just brought you into the company and made you feel much more a part of like the process of putting comics together and the people behind it. So you cared about that stuff as much as you cared about the comics themselves.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting. These were immensely popular at the time. Like, everybody looked forward to them every year for the reason you're saying. It was a way to connect, and it was cool. And the other part was, yeah, you've got all this amazing art that you didn't get anywhere else. So that's what's so amazing. And you got to think that had they only known how much more they might have put in. So this is really a chance to look back at that. How long have you been working on it? And give us a little idea of kind of the impetus of this project. I'm sure it goes hand in hand with the other origin book we're going to talk about in a second.
It does, but it also, I don't know which one predates the other, but they're both books that I loved. They're both things that I loved as a kid. And so I was at San Diego-based publisher called IDW for about 15 years. And IDW did a lot of archival books, notably Scott Doombeer's artist editions. I ran a line of IDW Limited books that did these high-end Marvel collections with big career-spanning interviews with the creators that were involved. And so there was always this big thrust to do archival, preservation kinds of books. So I wanted to do this calendar book forever. And it was a thing that just, for whatever reason, could never quite come to pass. Part of it was there was a difficulty on the production end in just replicating these things. All these calendars had spiral bindings to them. So you either had to tear the pages out, in which case you had to do a ton of restoration work to, sort of digitally repair all of the tears from the spiral binding, or you had to scan it and try to flatten the binding. Anyway, it was a big sort of involved ordeal, and we just couldn't quite make the scans work right, couldn't get the colors right. And so it wasn't until I left IDW and I found a production person named David Banks, who's great at doing the restoration work. He mostly just does it for fun, like for his own edification and fun. But on this, he and I started talking, so he showed me some proof of concept that he could actually do the stuff right, get the color right. He did cleanup on it, but we didn't do any kind of new colors. We didn't do anything that changed and modernized the look. So it really is as close to just the original look and feel of these calendars as possible. Although what we did do was, rather than have them hanging vertically the way calendars do on your walls, we formatted the book like a proper book. So they're horizontal. So on one side you get the artwork, the other side you get the calendar grid, just because I didn't want people to have to turn this big, heavy 13 by 13 hardcover sideways. Like, it just doesn't make for a great reading experience. And so, yeah, that was what sort of got the process started. And then once Abrams signed on, and once the great Charlie Kochman agreed to be the editor on the book, um, then kind of the fun part got underway, which was the excavation. Not only getting the calendars all up to snuff and ready for print, but then finding a lot of cool extras, all these process pieces, these memos that the editors wrote to Stan Lee or vice versa. A lot of the hand-drawn pieces. Like, what the book does is not only showcase this art and all this stuff that hasn't been seen, sometimes not at all since the calendars were released, even though they were drawn by the best artists that Marvel had at the time, Jack Kirby, John Buscema, Michael Golden, John Byrne, Frank Miller, John, on and on and on. But it also kind of takes you behind the scenes of what it was like to put these kind of things together in a pre-computer era, where you get a sense of just how handmade these kind of things were and how just laborious they must have been. So you get the sense that there's no way that the time involved was worth the end product. So it was just like they were doing this stuff because it was cool, and it was like an enhancement to Marvel's brand and its characters and all of that. But there's no way it made sense on the bottom line for the amount of work that it must have entailed, which I love that. I love that they just did stuff for the love of it, and they just by hand they just made these things, and that became so lasting and cool.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was curious about, what kind of added features we were going to have in here, because obviously it's not just a calendar book. I mean, it would be amazing if it was just that, but the fact that it's so much more, because going back to talking about the Origins book, which it's a little bit of its time, it's reprints, and there's sort of essays, I guess we would say, from Stan, giving his, take on... I think it came out 10 years, 1974 was the first edition of the Origins book. Everybody reprints like, Fantastic Four and Fantasy 15 and those early appearances 10 years after, when the prices had gone up and your everyday comic fan maybe couldn't find it or couldn't afford it. And to think about, it was, Fantastic Four #1 was $40. Oh, God,
Yeah, I know.
Of course, now we're like, whatever. But I loved what you added into that Origin book and how you gave it context to its time and what have you. So not the same thing with the calendar here, but definitely adding material to enrich the experience. Is that accurate?
Yeah, for the most part in the calendar book, it was all, there's an introduction by Roy Thomas, who was the writer and editor of the first Marvel calendar that followed this format. So he was the one who kind of pioneered the format for these calendars. So he wrote the introduction for the book. But then the rest of it is, I do introduction that explains, the importance and cool factor of the calendar. And then I also introduce every one of the years that's collected in there, talk about the different artists, talk about why they were cool. Most of the calendars followed a specific theme. And so you got some that were, celebrating Marvel's greatest moments in their first, 15 or whatever years of the company's history. There was one that was focused just on Spider-Man, one focused on the Hulk, and they were the two big TV stars at the time when these calendars came out. There was another that was focused on Doctor Strange, who, it's kind of funny, like, he was envisioned to be the next big TV star that thought he was going to go on to get his own series, and then they did this made-for-TV movie with Doctor Strange that was just a huge dud. It just... Yeah. It didn't look like, didn't feel like, it just wasn't, they just couldn't quite do Doctor Strange the way he would have needed to work. But he still got a cool calendar out of it that had these great pieces by, guys like, again, Frank Miller, Pat Broderick, Dave Cockrum, Alan Weiss, Jim Starlin, like all these amazing talents. And so I sort of explained what makes each one of them cool, sort of broke down the bicentennial calendar that they did in 1976 and why it's kind of like such a relic of its time, but is charming in its way too, in that every one of those months they dropped the Marvel characters into different scenes from the Revolutionary War. And so there's some that maybe age better, are more historically, none of them are accurate, you know what I mean? But they're maybe more historically appropriate than others. And it just, some of that stuff's very fun to see because, again, it just hasn't been unearthed and seen in so long, almost since the calendars first came out. And so I found a lot of that. And then in the back, I found all kinds of essays, thanks to the help of either some hardcore collectors. In one case, I worked through David Anthony Kraft's widow, who had a lot of his the hand-drawn pieces, like the 78 and 79 calendars. he hand sketched every piece that he wanted the artist to draw, and then he hand drew every single detail on the calendar grids, and that then the production people sort of mocked up and made real. And it's just, again, just seeing the amount of work and time that he put into these things. It was a blast to be able to collect that stuff in the back, because I'd never seen those. Like, they've been in David Kraft's Widow's hands for basically since he made them, and so there's a lot of stuff in that calendar book that's just never been seen before, and I love that. I love, like I say, taking people behind the scenes a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a must-have for any Marvel fan, especially this one, especially because, like you're saying, Chris, a lot of this stuff hasn't been seen since, and as must-have as these calendars were, a lot of us weren't, around, or we didn't have the availability,
or didn't even know about them, and
right.
For some people, and so again, yeah, there are these great Jack Kirby images that nobody's ever seen since the calendars came out. You also in the back, I found there's Kirby did one of the covers for the calendar, the 77 calendar. And so he penciled like all the different Marvel heroes. And then you see the finished product inked by John Romita. And it's so Romita reworked and redone, and in some cases repenciled. And, I understand that at that point, Stan Lee thought John Romita's version of the characters was like the most publicly accessible and friendly versions of the characters, especially on stuff like this that was aimed for a broader audience outside of just the comic buying audience. So you understand why Romita reworked everything, but still just seeing, like, it's Jack Kirby, and seeing Jack Kirby's pencils get so revised, like, it's nice to be able to showcase what they originally looked like, and then you can see, you can compare it to the inked and the finished versions, but finally Kirby's originals get seen the way he at least intended.
Yeah, it's always awesome to see. I mean, he's been gone for so long now. We're getting, as a fan, being able to see some of his art for the first time, as like you said, as it was intended, is really fantastic. The other thing that's so exciting to me about this calendar, and I don't know if you've heard from people or what, but because it is a little bit more, what was harder to get was a little more obscure, as opposed to the origin book, which a lot of people know about, and it's a little more kind of in the comic collector zeitgeist, and I think there's even been reprints, if I'm not mistaken.
There was a reissue in '97. They got new covers done for the reissues, which they just feel completely like out of place, because these books, like you say, are collected stories from the '60s.
Yep.
And what it does is the book collects two stories from each of the characters. So you get their origin story, their very first appearance, and then you got what was then a more modern story, but it was still a story from maybe the mid to late '60s.
Right.
And so when you had this cover in '97 by late '90s artists, like, it just, the cover and the contents didn't match each other at all. So it was great to finally, after a couple decades entirely out of print, to bring it back, not only in one case with the original cover, like on the replica edition, but then we did on this deluxe edition that I edited, Alex Ross painted the cover, and he addressed what sort of became the other point of, like, sort of lasting controversy about this book, which is, like you say, Stan Lee wrote intros before every one of the characters that are featured in the book, and it is very much like the Stan Lee centric version of the universe. And so, it's Stan not being as gracious to the artist as he was to himself, certainly, or, I mean, some of it we always view from a lens of today, where credit is so much more, I don't want to say important, because it was important then too, but there's more of a financial component to it now. So I think it has taken on that added weight. But at the time, I don't know that he was trying to be as sort of, disregarding to the artist as people have come to think. But again, I don't know. I just know that as a kid reading these intros, they were very fun, and they made you feel a part of the Marvel Universe. But of course, like I say, the people that want to, take fault with the way Stan took credit for things more than he should have over the years, they can't stand this book for that reason, because, it's not gracious enough to Jack or to Steve Ditko or to the other artists who drew these stories. And so we touch on that. We talk about it. We certainly talk about the way these artists and writer, like the way they work together, sort of made each other better. And together they created this amazing universe that we're still talking about and enamored with today. But it's not like, I wasn't interested in doing this sort of vitriolic correct all, which I think some people wanted this book to be,
Right.
which
Yeah.
it's not that kind of book. Like it was a populist kind of book that just introduced these characters, and I certainly wasn't going to speak over Stan's intros. Like I could do my own book where I just did the my version of the history of Marvel if I wanted to do that. And so again, like I saw some people online really posting some nastiness about this book because it doesn't do what they wanted it to do, which is attack Stan Lee, but they
That's
can
not
write
the
that book.
yeah.
That's not a
Yeah.
book I'm interested in doing. That's not what this book is. So
Yeah, I mean it's of its time, you know, add some context, but again, it's a snapshot, and for some people it's nostalgia, and we're not commenting on, you know, whether what Stan said was, you know, correct or not. That's not what this is. But to kind of extend that sort of sensibility to this calendar, obviously it doesn't have that same sort of controversy, but because it was again, like you said, some people didn't know about these or they were harder to get. Have you heard from people that are highly anticipating this book? Is there, because I know there's that side of the, you know, collectability side of it where there's some people that are like, man, they've never had the chance to see this stuff or to have it in their collection before. So, and you may not know, maybe be too early to say because, you know, again, everybody, we're recording this the day before it comes out and it's not out there and you haven't heard feedback. But to the extent that you have, does it seem like people are excited for this calendar book?
yeah, well, so the funny thing about it is it was originally solicited for release December of 23. And so, you know, it was on sale months prior to that. And then through various printing situations, it moved back to right now. But so I've been hearing from people for like a year that were excited about it or that were frustrated that the release date moved back. And I've sold a few copies to people directly because I sold like a signed edition alongside some of the hand-drawn David Kraft pieces. And there's also a replica calendar of the 1975 calendar was reissued on its own as a spiral bound wall hanging sort of thing because the dates from 75 and 2025 match up. And so,
Oh, gotcha.
you know, Abrams got behind that idea as well, doing a replica calendar. But anyway, so I've been hearing from people about it that way. And then I did a speaking event at the Comic-Con Museum down here last weekend and had some books there so people could flip through it and see it. And I mean, it's such a big, weighty book that it's hard not to sort of feel dazzled by the size and the impact of just these very cool, unique images, you know, coming at you as you flip through the pages. And so, yeah, I think I think anticipation is there, and I think the people that have seen it have really dug it. And so I've been real happy about the reception so far. So I'm really eager to finally get it out in the world in a big way because, like I say, it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, and I feel like the Origins book, it is a little more, you know, obviously they're both archival, but, you know, that one with the reprints and you know, a lot of text and what have you, it's more, God, I'm not sure what the right word is, but it's more kind of a snapshot.
It's at least been seen before.
Yeah, well, and it's a snapshot of Marvel history, right? I feel like this calendar book, it's more aptly described or accurately described as an art book because it's mostly visual. You know, and again, to have a lot of this art from these amazing talents that were the ones that really, you know, either created the characters or it created the visual versions of the characters that we know and have stood the test of time, to be able to see this art for the first time. I mean, I just think there's so much value, and I'm really excited for it myself.
And the cool thing about it is, like, when you're reading the grid, you know, you're reading their puns and their jokes and stuff are very sort of, I don't know, it's like genteel, poking fun at themselves, but also very dad jokey kind of way. Yeah. And you know, it's very much in the keeping with like the tone that Marvel took toward all their stuff back in the day, which is kind of light self-deprecation, but also, you know, a sense of their own greatness and everything like that. The funny thing about Origins is, and again, like, it's every time I mention this book, like I see somebody online goes on a rant about how I'm apologizing for Stan Lee or I'm making excuses or I'm this and that. And I'm amused by it, but also just frustrated by it. But the good thing for those fans is there's a book that was just, I think it came out the same month or a month prior, but it's like the person who wrote that had a very specific point of view where they spent a whole book writing about what they called the lies Stan Lee told throughout the Origins of Marvel Comics book. And so it's almost a twisted companion piece to this book. Yeah. And so if you want to read this book and then go see somebody's point of view about what Stan Lee got wrong, or what they felt I should have said, or all of that. There are these two sort of competing books out there, but this one, I mean, this one is a unique and sort of, like I say, controversial and attention-getting book for that reason. But the other reason it was notable back in the day is, other than Jules Feiffer did a book called The Great Comic Book Heroes that mostly just collected old stories. It didn't really have a whole lot of context and text pieces in there. So other than that book, this is the very first sort of graphic novel-sized collection of Marvel's material that was ever released in bookstores or available in libraries. And so it's funny, like when I was telling somebody that at the library, they're like, come on, like there's never been a world where this stuff wasn't always available in bookstores. I'm like, no, really? Like when I was a kid, like, and then you sound like, you sound like you're dating yourself by going, no, in my day, there weren't graphic novel sections in bookstores, but there really weren't. And so this was the first book that not only made this stuff available, but it also kind of, I don't know, legitimized comics in our parents' eyes. Because instead of these little disposable 25-cent magazines that we were reading, and they were sort of embarrassed we were reading, they now saw this book in a bookstore alongside the stuff they were buying. So they had to acknowledge that it was worthy of being sold in bookstores the way their books were. And so it just kind of changed the world's opinion to some degree of how they regarded comic book material.
Yeah, 100%. I people, that are either not of an older generation than you and I, or the same generation. Yeah, I mean, I remember, like, if I wanted to finish a story and I didn't have the issue, there was nowhere to go but to go and look for the back issue and find that issue. It's not like nowadays we're Marvel Unlimited and, Comixology and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, whippersnappers don't know how easy you have it.
Well, that, and also people that couldn't afford comics, like we'd go to the library and just check out this book over and over and over again. And so eventually the stories just become like song lyrics in your head. You just have consumed them so many times. So it really was like visiting an old friend, going back through this book and then being able to contribute to it, and then get people like Larry Lieber and Alex Ross and Tom Brevoort and talk to the original editor that, put the books back together back in the day, have her a part of this book. And all the extras that we found in there, old ads and artwork and concept art and sketches. And then I found an old LA Times review that science fiction author Ray Bradbury did, where it's a very odd but cool review of the book and everything. And so it's just, the deluxe edition has all kinds of fun extras that, again, I love, like setting the context and just tackling these books from all the different sides that we can.
Yeah, and everybody, again, we know that Stan didn't give maybe the level of credit that he should have, but the thing I always remind everybody is Stan's job, and again, I know this is not, I'm not apologizing for him, I'm not saying it's right. Stan's job was to hype the books. Stan's job wasn't to make sure everybody got the credit. That he was trying to sell comics. He was a hype man. He was really good at it. Maybe he hyped himself too much, at the extent of others. That's probably the case. I probably would agree with you there. But the thing that I always come back to is I don't think anything was done out of malice. It wasn't malicious. He was just trying to, sell the books. So,
and maybe it was, like, who knows? But again, I don't know. Like, I don't know. And so, I mean, we all wish he was more gracious to Jack Kirby in print and to Steve Ditko and stuff.
Of course.
Absolutely. But I don't think that takes away from, like, the impact and the meaning that this book had for a lot of people. And, I didn't grow up thinking, oh my God, Stan Lee did everything himself. Like, these artists had nothing to do with it. So I don't think the Stan Lee version of history is what lodged in everybody's heads. But I also can't speak for the way other people interpreted the book. Like, this is the first time I became aware of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, other than knowing of them, but I didn't see their work before this. And so to me, it was like, oh, these are the guys that told the first stories. They're all just as important. Like, they all played a part in this. And so that was sort of how I viewed things then and now, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, same. It was my first exposure to Jack Kirby's art was the Origins book. I think my first exposure to Steve's work was probably Marvel Tales reprints of
which again, like, we would get the occasional reprint, but they weren't consistent, or they weren't even always printed in order and things like that. And so this book was a great way to get a sense of, like, the previous era of Marvel. The biggest thing it did to me was it exposed me to not only these bigger names that I had at least heard of before, but like I didn't know who Marie Severin was.
Right.
And you see Marie Severin's work in this book, and you're like, talk about unsung. Like if anybody deserved more credit for what they contributed to Marvel back in the day, like Marie, I think still hasn't been praised enough or as properly as she deserves for everything that she did for them. So yeah, I think there's never enough credit given to all the people that sort of built the Marvel universe. And we tried to do that to a much greater degree than the original book did, but again, in a conversational and fun way, and not in a shrill way anyway. So
yeah, and you're going to get like Chris said at the beginning, you're going to get a lot of snapshots and a little bit of those people's personalities in the calendar book, because like he said, there's pictures and puns and that sort of thing as well. So I want to thank you for taking the time, Chris. Everybody, I'm going to put a link in the show notes where you can go and get the calendar book, also the Origins book. It's going to be available everywhere as far as I know, right, Chris? Like comic shops, Amazon, bookstores, Barnes & Noble, all that sort of stuff, right? Widespread distribution. Yeah,
oh yeah, absolutely. And I can sign copies if anybody needs a personalized gift or anything like that. So yeah, hopefully they're available anywhere and everywhere.
Okay, great. And anything else that you want to let our audience know as we're closing out here?
No, I mean, I'm working on a couple of things I can't announce just yet, other stuff along these lines that sort of celebrate the history of various companies. But also I have an imprinted image, and I've got a Christmas horror one-shot, like an anthology one-shot that is a lot of different Christmas stories with a very dark twist to them, coming out in early December, called Dread the Halls. So
fantastic. Well, if anybody wants to follow along so they know when things like that are coming out, or when you have more archival stuff, where's the best place online to get news about things you're working on?
I mean, at this point, I think I will be spending more time at like Blue Sky and Threads than any past other social media sites that have fallen into become hellscapes. And then beyond that, I also do a Substack newsletter roughly once a week-ish, where I talk about, new stuff, old comics, and I also do a regular feature that focuses on like comics in the spinner rack, different themes and sort of repeating cover motifs over the years, and just collecting those in fun ways. And so, yeah, it's just constant, I don't know, comic commentary anyway. So
fantastic. I'll put a link to the Blue Sky and the Substack in the show notes as well, everybody. So if you're having trouble finding Chris, just go and look in the show notes. So again, Chris, thanks so much for taking the time. Really looking forward to getting my hands on this calendar book.
Yeah, man. Thank you very much. Always good talking to you.
And to you out there in the audience, whether you're checking us out on YouTube or listening to the audio feed, Chris and I both want to extend our gratitude for you joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next time.